Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my Lit 101 series with a look at historical poetry. So there's multiple ways to experience history, and a lot of times people get the sense that the best way to experience history is through historical textbooks, where everything is very kind of cut and dry, there's no pesky emotion getting in the way, and you get the facts and that's it. But history is very subjective. There is a push in academia to sort of accept that history books are always going to be a little bit subjective. Now, there are, of course, like hard and fast things that everyone can sort of agree on. Things like the date that World War II started, for example, that's sort of accepted fact. And there's a lot of events that are, we know that happened for sure. A lot of times history is colored by how we view it. And so a lot of times when we're looking at analyzing history, we're looking at why things happen, the causes of certain things. That's where you start to get into more subjective opinions on things. And so you have, one book that'll say, this was the primary cause of this event. And then another will say, well, actually, we need to think about this aspect and this and that and that. And so a lot of times history is very much about connecting the person engaging with it with sort of the people and the places of that historical time period. And so one way we can do that is through art, because art is very subjective, but art allows us to sort of connect with historical events in a way that is, I don't know, it reaches us at a deeper level than, say, just reading it in a textbook. And so even though artistic license is often required in order to translate historical events into an artistic medium, it's still a really valuable way to sort of connect with history in a sense that sort of allows us to learn from it. And that, I think, is why historical art is so important. One great example of this is the musical Newsies. It's a great look at sort of the worker revolts in the late 1900s or the late 1800s, early 1900s. And even though there's certain historical license taken in that musical in order to sort of make it fit into a kind of structured narrative, it still portrays the truth of the kind of rage and helplessness of the newspaper boys who all sort of banded together to fight for better rights. And so that is still valuable, even though it's a musical and even though it's not 100% historically accurate. It does teach us about sort of how people were feeling at that time and what it was like to be sort of in the middle of this kind of worker strike. And so moving on to historical poetry, I think that's one thing that it does really well. A historical poem isn't going to be able to have every single minute detail about the historical period in it, but it gives the reader a chance to sort of experience a historical event in a way that allows them to connect with it in a meaningful way. They can connect with the people involved, they can connect with the attitudes of the society at the time, and it's a really interesting way to experience history outside of, historical fiction or movies or musicals, that kind of stuff. And so that's why I think historical poetry is really important. So I've got two examples today, and they're very different poems, but I think they give really interesting portraits into the eras that they're depicting. And so the first one that I wanted to talk to you today about is the poem Hattie McDaniel Arrives at the Coconut Grove by Rita Dove. This is one of my favorite poems. I love it so much, and it's got so much packed into it. It's not a very long poem, but there's so much in there that you could spend hours and hours picking apart all the little references and historical allusions within it. But even without knowing all of the context, the poem is still really powerful and really interesting and really engaging. So this poem was written in 2016, and it depicts the moment when Hattie McDaniel accepted her Academy Award for playing the character Mammy in the 1939 movie Gone with the Wind. Now, this is a recent poem, and so I don't want to step on any copyright toes because it's not in the public domain. Rita Dove is very much still around and still doing her thing, and I don't want to infringe on anything. So instead, what I'll do, there is a link to the poem below, but you can also, I'm going to put a link to a reading that Rita Dove does of the poem. So you can hear the poet herself read the poem. And she does a better job at it than I would ever have anyway. So you don't want to hear me read this poem. But it's an incredible poem. So I will give you a moment. Go read the poem. You can either read the written poem, it's on poets.org, or you can listen to the author reading it and then come back to this video and we'll continue from there. All right, you're back. So let's get into the poem itself. There's probably some aspects of the poem that maybe you didn't get. There's some allusions that you didn't quite understand. That's totally okay. I'll give you a bit of historical context and then we'll just sort of look at what the poem is doing overall. So let's get into it. Starting off with a little bit of historical context, Hattie McDaniel was a terrific actor, but in her career, she was so often typecast as a servant or a maid, that kind of character, because she could have played a lead. She could have very well played a really incredible drama production, but her characters were always sort of kindly but simple-minded maid characters, which isn't great. She deserved a lot more. Hattie McDaniel was also acting at a time when Jim Crow was still very much in effect. Black people in America were still subject to very strict laws about how they were allowed to act, and it also dictated segregation laws, which were very, very strict. To put this in kind of historical context, Rosa Parks's leading of the Montgomery bus boycott would be about 15 years after this. That was in 1955. At the time when this happened, Martin Luther King Jr. was about 11 years old. He was born in 1929. So the civil rights movement was very much an underground thing at this point. It wasn't really a concerted nationwide effort. There was definitely activists, but for the most part, this was a very restrictive time. And so the Coconut Grove was the ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel where the Academy Awards were held. It was the 12th Academy Award. At first, the hotel was strictly whites only. No black people were allowed there unless they were maids or waiters. And so the Academy sort of got into a bit of a fight with the hotel because Hattie McDaniel was nominated, and so they said, you have to let her in because, she has to be here. This is important. And they eventually reached a compromise. She could attend with sort of friends and family, but she had to sit in sort of a roped off area that was way far away from the stage. So you've got like the stage where they're presenting the awards. Usually all the people who are nominated for the awards are seated in kind of the first area, and then behind that are sort of the guests and all that kind of stuff. People who are visiting who aren't necessarily, didn't necessarily, were a part of this. But the area where Hattie McDaniel had to sit was way far away, and it was like roped off. It was so insulting. And so when she accepted her award, she won Best Supporting Actress. When she accepted the award, she had to walk a long way from this roped off area up to the front to accept her reward. She did get, I think, a standing ovation while she did it, but it was a very long moment. Now, I should also say that Hattie McDaniel was the first black person to win an Oscar ever. Sidney Poitier was I think, the next one. He was the first black man to win an Oscar, and he won it in 1964 for Lilies of the Field. So that would have been like 24 years after this. So this is a very important moment. And also the first time a black woman won Best Actress was Halle Berry in 2001. So, there was a trending hashtag a few years back, Oscars so white. And this has been a long-standing issue. This isn't just something that was sort of important that particular year. This has been going on for a long time. What I really like about this poem is that it looks at her both as a character and as a person. And so it looks at scenes from her movies. There's quite a few references to characters she's played and moments in movies that stick with her. One that I think you might know is the moment in Gone with the Wind where she shows Rhett Butler that she's actually wearing the silk satin petticoat that he got for her that she's always wanted. She makes a reference at one point that she's always wanted a really stiff silk, or not silk, a really stiff satin petticoat in red that would sort of rustle when she walked, because she thought that was very fancy. And so there's a moment when she kind of pulls up her dress and shows him that she's wearing this petticoat, which is a little saucy, and she has this sort of little laugh that she gives him. And it's a cute moment because it's sort of, you know, this moment where she's just delighted and happy, but then she goes back to being kind of what she has always done, which is sort of this devoted servant. So there's a lot of complex things at play there, but it is a good moment, and Rita Dove makes sure to kind of call attention to that moment because it sort of captures everything that people loved about her, because she had this sort of, she was powerful, she was lovable, she was kind of saucy, and I don't know, she had this kind of twinkle in her eye that always sort of delighted people. And if she had been given lead roles, she would have been just phenomenal. She's such a good actress, but she was never really given that chance. And so her role as Mammy was sort of the pinnacle of her career, and she was never really able to escape that typecasting after that. This poem is also looking at sort of the contradictions inherent to her situation. It's looking at her as sort of a respected actress who's winning one of the best awards in the business, but at the same time, it's also like highlighting how she was never seen as equal with her other actor compatriots. Her co-star Vivien Leigh won the award for Best Actress that year for playing Scarlett O'Hara. In fact, I think Gone with the Wind swept the Oscars that year. It was up against a bunch of other really great films. I think Wuthering Heights also came out that year, and The Wizard of Oz also. This is the year when Over the Rainbow won the Oscar for Best Original Song. I'm sorry, I have too much like film history facts. I'll keep those to a minimum. But so it was stiff competition, and the fact that she won it all was a very big deal. Now, a lot of people said that it was sort of a political stunt and that she didn't deserve it. I would disagree with that. I would say she absolutely deserved it. Her character is one of the best characters in that movie, but there is a lot of kind of byplay within this poem, looking at sort of how Hollywood saw her, how the everyday person saw her, and this kind of weird mix of sort of, she was respected, but she was never really seen as someone who could do more. You know, it was like she's really good at doing maids and servants, but that's all we kind of want her to be. And so there's this look at sort of how Hattie McDaniel was seen by people, even though it also points out moments where she was obviously very smart, very witty. I love her moment. I think it's like in the middle of the poem where, you know, someone tells her, you know, you need to not, you know, associate with lower types of people, and she says, that's so great, I'll start by not associating with you, and then kind of moved on. Like, she was a witty, charming, wonderful person with this big personality, and she was sort of demonized for it because it was sort of this, there was this idea that, you know, she won the Oscar and she should just be grateful for it because most people didn't think she deserved it, kind of thing. So the poem gets into a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of depth to it, and there's a lot of digging in if you scratch beneath the surface. On the surface, the poem is just about her walking up to the stage to accept this award, and I love the line at the end where she's like, let them wait, because it would have taken her so long to get to the front, and you know, the longer it took, the more people in the audience would have been made uncomfortable by this idea that, like, oh, we forced this award-winning actress to sit in a roped-off area way back there, and she couldn't sit with us because of stupid rules that didn't make sense. And so there's this sense, she's like, nope, you're powerful, own it. When you go up and accept that award, make sure you take as long as you want, so everyone else has to wait for you because you're the most important person in the room at that point. And it's such a powerful moment. I love this poem so much, and Rita Dove does such a good job of capturing her personality and also the way other people perceived her. And there's a lot of nuance there. When you initially read the poem, you might not pick up on everything. There's lots of references to like characters she's played and like her personal life as well. And so I hope that reading something like this would sort of encourage you to go out and learn more about the real actress and the things that happened in her life and her career and her talent and everything. And that's, I think, why historical poems can be so important, because they kind of they show you a glimpse of someone or something, and they say, this really happened. You can go and learn more about this. And I think that's what I like about this one so much. All right, moving on to the second poem. This one is very, very different, but I still deeply love this one. This is the poem Shirt by Robert Pinsky. It was written in 1990, and it details the events of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This happened in Greenwich Village in New York, and it was one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. I think there have been others that are worse, but this is definitely one of the worst, and it was sort of a big watershed moment for a lot of people in terms of the struggle for workers' rights. So, this is another one that the poet is still around, and I don't want to step on any toes. So I have a link here to the poet himself reading it. I love the way that he reads this poem. He has this sort of rhythm and intonation, and the way he emphasizes certain words and certain sounds just adds so much to the poem. So again, he does it better than I ever could. So go and listen to him read the poem, and then come back to the video. I'll also put a link down below where you can read the poem itself on poets.org. So go read that and then come back. All right, you're back. So let's get into some of the kind of cultural context surrounding this first. So at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a very long, protracted period, and it was sort of bracketed by two depressions. There was the depression of the 1890s, and then there was the depression of the 1930s. And in the years in between there, and there was also World War I happening in between there as well, there was a very long and violent sort of revolution for workers' rights happening sort of all over the country. There was thousands of strikes, of protests. It was to the point where the police and the army was called in. A ton of workers and protesters were shot and killed or lynched unofficially or were jailed, and it was just one of these huge moments that I don't think people talk about that much. But the people that were fighting, they were fighting for workers' rights, because before this there was really appalling work hours. People were paid barely anything. There was child labor. The working conditions were dangerous, and employers would frequently cut wages to save money, even though the people working there were already well below the poverty line. And there was also racial tensions in all this. One thing is, Irish workers went on strike, and it was an important moment for Irish immigrants who were treated badly, but the companies would then hire black workers as scabs, and so then the Irish workers would then lynch the black workers because they saw them as taking their jobs, rather than putting their energy into fighting against the companies that were creating the situation in the first place. So it was just a violent, awful period where everyone was so angry and hurt and not treated well, and people were really working to make things better. And this is also where we get things like the 5-day work week, the 8-hour work day, the dissolution of child labor, mandatory breaks, all those kinds of things that we sort of have today was because of these people who fought for those rights in that period. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was kind of a tall building, multi-storied, and the conditions inside were very dusty and warm, and it wasn't a very safe place to work. People were packed in there. They got some breaks here and there, but it wasn't a very safe working environment. I think the laws at the time said that the building like this, the doors had to open outward, and they also had to be unlocked. But in this case, the doors opened inward, and they were locked because the people who ran the factory didn't want the workers escaping during the day in order to sort of get away from doing their work. So they were trapped in this building with no way to get out. And so when fire broke out, it just took everything really, really quickly, and there was no way for the people inside to get out, especially the ones working on the top level. And so the only way they had out was to either try jumping out the windows, but the building was high enough that it wasn't there's no way they could have survived that fall. It was just dreadful. And so there was like over 140 people were killed in this horrific event. And this was sort of a watershed moment for workers kind of all over the place. This happened in Greenwich Village, and it was sort of one of the events of this sort of worker revolt that showed just how badly people were being treated and just how dangerous it was when workers were neglected like this. And it kind of caught the public eye. Now, it would be a few more years before things would start to meaningfully change, but this was one of those shocking, horrible moments that really showed people, hey, we need to have safe working conditions or safer working conditions, and we need to ensure that these people are safe, and in the event of an emergency, they can get out. Just a horrific accident that killed a lot of people, and it was horrifying. What I like about this poem is that it very much humanizes the workers, because it starts out, it almost depicts kind of a fun moment. You've got everyone sort of, they're having breaks and they're talking and eating, and then when they're working, they're sort of, talking amongst themselves. And so it sort of depicts this thing. It's like, even though they were in this bad condition, these people just wanted to work. They wanted to support their families. They found camaraderie with their fellow workers. Like it didn't have to be a terrible environment, and so they were fine. And there's this sort of rhythmic feel to the way that he starts it, and there's kind of a few moments throughout where he starts listing sort of the machinery involved, like the mangle and the loom, and you really feel kind of this thumping rhythm of the machinery kind of around these people and the voices as they're talking. And so you get a sort of a sensory experience of what it would be like to be in this sort of dusty, cramped area with everyone working all these big machines, talking to each other, and it's sort of almost ominous, but at the same time it's sort of comforting, because it's just everyone's working and there's this kind of bustle of activity. And then the fire itself sort of happens in the middle of the poem, and it's shocking and horrifying, and especially the depictions from the outside of an observer sort of watching one of the workers trying to help the women go out the windows, even though they were probably going to fall to their deaths, because it was the only way they could go. And sometimes it might have been better to plummet from a window than to burn slowly in the fire. Like, it was just, he really captures the sort of horrifying experience of being trapped in a burning building with nowhere to go. And then as people are falling from the windows, he focuses on the fabric of the clothing, noticing sort of how well it's made and the patterns on the fabric. And there's this kind of reference to artificial tartans that aren't linked to any real Scottish clans. And then talking back, there's this mention of the hoax of Ossian, which is, this is a sort of epic Celtic poem that was sort of revealed to be a hoax. It isn't sort of a real poem, it was sort of fabricated. And there's also mention of sort of the way that tartans were outlawed in Scotland when the British occupied it. And so there was all these kind of fake tartans that were sort of allowed, like people were allowed to make in order to kind of keep them happy, because these fake tartans weren't connected to any actual clans, and so they couldn't use the tartans as any kind of rallying symbol to kind of connect with their own people and rise up against the English. And so there's this kind of, he distances himself a little bit from the horrifying events that are happening by focusing on the fabric. And then at the end of the poem, it's almost like it's dissociated completely, and we just sort of get this idea of, well, these are the shirts that you can find in the store, and you're admiring the craftsmanship. But by this point, the shirt itself has become sort of a symbol of all of the things that are wrong with the apparatus that's in place to build the shirt or to construct the shirt. And so you have moments at the beginning where you have these people sort of cheerfully working, even though they're working in terrible conditions, and then you've got this fire that reveals just how terrible these conditions are and how badly this disaster was, or like how bad this disaster was. But then at the end, when it returns to just sort of casually looking at the shirt on a store shelf, there's this idea that the shirt now means something kind of sinister, and it's like you have to kind of be aware of where your clothing comes from and how many sacrifices have to be made in order for you to be able to get it at such cheap prices. So the symbolism of the shirt itself takes on kind of a sinister cast at the end of the poem, which I think is really effective, because you've got this shocking moment in the middle where you're seeing people being thrown out the window to their deaths just to avoid another slower death. But then you see the shirt and you realize what it means, and all the people who are exploited in order to make that happen. And so when you're looking at these two poems, it's not just these are an important moment in history that you need to be aware of. They're very much about sort of the importance of reading history, because they were written after the fact, they were written in kind of the modern era, and reminding people to be aware of these historical events that are so important and that we need to not forget them. You've got Hattie McDaniel being the first black woman, the first black person to win an Oscar, and then you've got the workers in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory who died tragically for no reason. And often we read history not just because it's sort of academically interesting in a distant sense. The importance of reading history is so that we can avoid making those mistakes again. And so when we read history and engage with it, it's almost like it's a way to sort of vaccinate yourself against making those mistakes in the future, because you're aware, hindsight's 2020. And so when you're looking back at a historical event and you can see how unfair it was, and you can see how all the things that led up to that event that could have been avoided, you can then say, all right, we know that happened, we know why it was bad, so now we know how to avoid that in the future. And I think that's why history is so important. I specialized in English, and so I have so much respect for historians and history teachers, because history is this massive, huge thing, and there's always this conflict between the people who believe that sort of history is inviolate and absolute and unchanging, and then there's other people that say, well, history looks different depending on what perspectives you're seeing it from. And so often history is seen from the point of view of rulers or leaders, presidents and kings, looking down on events that kind of shape the big things like borders and wars and that kind of stuff. But history is almost more interesting when you're looking at the everyday people and the effects that big sweeping decisions have on the lives of everyday people. And so that's why I think historical poetry is important and valuable, and why we need to keep reading it. Now, if you're interested in historical poetry and you want to read more, there's tons out there, and there's all different subjects and all different historical eras. But one that I'd suggest would be If They Come For Us by Fatima Ashgar. This is a nonfiction poetry collection, and it looks at the experience of being sort of a Pakistani immigrant living in the West, but it also looks at the historical events of partition, which kind of fractured India from Pakistan. And so there was sort of this divide, and the Hindus were sort of pushed into India and the Muslims were pushed into Pakistan, and it was a very traumatizing event. And this poet, so the MCU miniseries Miss Marvel, the episode where Kamala Khan goes back in time and witnesses the events of partition, that episode was written by this poet. And so, if you don't want to read a poem about the event, there's definitely other ways to do that. Another great example is in Doctor Who. There's an episode called The Demons of Punjab, which also looks at partition from kind of a slightly different perspective. I would say the Miss Marvel episode is better, because I think it gets at sort of the chaos and the uncertainty and the terror of that event. But I mean, both are good, and I love when science fiction allows us to sort of interrogate historical events in cool ways. But there's tons of other historical poems out there that look at many different eras and people, and it's such a cool way to engage with history. And it also is a great jumping off point, because when you experience a historical event through a poem or through like an episode of TV or something, and then you go back to sort of the history textbook that is a little bit drier, when you have that context of sort of the emotional impact of what was happening, and then you're reading it in a kind of textbook, it feels less dry because you can kind of relate to it a little more. You can understand it. It's not just names and dates, it's people living in a real world. And I think that's really interesting. So, with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.